And now turning to the escalating war of words between President Trump and Ukraine's President Zelensky. Here's the latest from President Trump after Zelensky's comments about Trump living in a disinformation bubble.
A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast. I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered, and millions of people have unnecessarily died.
Still this morning, the diplomacy between the two countries continues on, with U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, in Kyiv. And we have some new behind-the-scenes reporting that these tensions were simmering behind the scenes for the last week before boiling over into the public view. The turning point in the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship began at last week's Munich Security Conference. You'll recall those comments from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth saying Ukraine will not join NATO. Privately, we're told, Hegseth stunned the Ukrainians when he told them at a meeting with Zelensky that the Trump administration is considering drawing down many U.S. forces in Europe. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel is in Kharkiv, Ukraine. Also with us, former advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky, Igor Novikov. So, Richard, as this war of words develops, President Zelensky is set to meet with Trump's Ukraine envoy, General Kellogg, today. What are the expectations for that meeting?
So I can tell you what the Ukrainian government is hoping to achieve. They want to change this narrative. They want to change President Trump's mind. They are anxious to take General Kellogg as much as they can around the country. They want to show him a different reality than the one that is being put forward by President Trump. And they also don't want to, and I've spoken to many Ukrainian officials and Ukrainian people, they don't want to be in this argument with President Trump, and they don't believe they started it. And just a short while ago, Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor, said on Fox News that it is the Ukrainians who need to tone down the rhetoric and that Zelensky better wise up and sign the minerals deal. And it hasn't been reported very extensively, but we've been talking more about the comments and President Trump calling Zelensky a dictator and Zelensky saying that President Trump seems to be trapped in a disinformation space. But this mineral deal really helped sort of sour relations. And I've spoken to a senior member of Zelensky's staff, and he said what happened was the Treasury Secretary came, he presented the Ukrainian side with a paper. They were told it was non-negotiable. They had to sign it quickly. And in this document, Ukraine was supposed to sign over 50% of its rare earth mineral rights. And they felt pressured into doing it. They didn't have any details about what they would get in return for this. And Zelensky didn't sign it. And he said as much publicly, saying that he didn't feel like he could sell his country down the river. And that certainly didn't help relations here. It seems that President Trump, because he's referenced this deal several times now, and he's referenced how President Zelensky is fleecing the United States, fleecing aid that the Ukraine owes money for the political and military support that is given this country. So that seems to be very much front of mind in President Trump's inner circle and with President Trump himself. So President Zelensky today is certainly not going on the attack. He's hosting this envoy. He wants to change the narrative. But according to the national security advisor, it is up to Ukraine now because Ukraine needs to tone down the rhetoric, not President Trump, who called President Zelensky a dictator or who said falsely that it was Ukraine that launched the war against Russia.
Richard Engel, thank you so much. And we just got those new images in of this meeting underway now between President Zelensky and the U.S. envoy to Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg there. And we're told that any remarks that they were expected to make before cameras are not going to happen. So these images are what we're left with. We'll, of course, be on top of any readout that comes after this meeting. Igor, I mentioned that new NBC News exclusive reporting about the tensions boiling over between Ukraine and the U.S., including the private comments from the defense secretary. Where does all of this leave Ukraine this morning? And what's your biggest concern about your country's lasting security?
Well, I'm obviously concerned, Anna, but at the same time, we're actually witnessing the opposite in Ukraine, witnessing a major rally around the flag effect. I mean, people are uniting behind Zelensky, and ironically, his approval rating in Ukraine despite the fact that a major war has been going on for 3 years and people are tired, is higher than that of President Trump during his first 100-day honeymoon with the American people. So, and like, look, I can tell you one thing, calling Zelensky a dictator is just ridiculous on many fronts. But what blows my mind is the fact that if he were a dictator, I think President Trump would have been in love with him, as we see with Putin, for example.
And we should note that Zelensky resoundingly won his last election, but the dictator comments were connected to the fact that Ukraine hasn't held an election. There was supposed to be one last year. I know because of martial law with the ongoing war, that's why there wasn't an election. Can you respond to those who say there should be elections?
There shouldn't be elections because A, it's illegal. And in order to hold those elections, we need to change Ukraine's constitution, which is also forbidden during martial law. And we're fighting major conflict. And even practically, I don't see how those elections can happen because half the country is abroad in different countries, some legally, some illegally. Half the country is fighting the war in the trenches. And, Russia is constantly bombarding our cities and everything. We have rockets, missiles, and like drones flying in. So I don't see how those elections could possibly happen. And if you ask Ukrainian politicians, with the exception of some pro-Russian ones who want that change of government, who want Ukraine to become Belarus or Georgia, for example, with a pro-Russian puppet government, everyone else in Ukrainian politics agrees, and the people overwhelmingly agree. I mean, the latest polls show upwards of 67% of people of Ukraine saying, like, we shouldn't hold elections until the war is over.
Igor, with President Trump, we've learned a lot can be transactional. He argues in this case that the U.S. keeps giving Ukraine billions and billions in aid, but isn't getting anything in return. We know Trump and the administration have mentioned Ukraine's rare earth minerals as a way to help build a, quote, strategic partnership. And Richard just walked us through some of the background on that. Should Ukraine be willing to make a deal on minerals and natural resources in exchange for all the support provided by the U.S.?
My personal opinion, yes, we should make that deal, but it's how we make that deal and what is actually in that deal. Because I've dealt with President Trump as President Zelensky's advisor during the first term, i.e. in 2019 and 2020. And I can tell you this, what's missing there, and, tragically, I'm seeing the same thing happen all over again in President Trump's second term, is the lack of respect for Ukraine. I mean, it's in Ukraine's interest to make that deal. It's in America's interest to make that deal. But I think what's going on here, Putin is literally wiping the floor with President Trump, giving more and more conditions and having made zero concessions, in the process. And I think President Trump is, because of his lack of respect for President Zelensky and for Ukraine, he's just venting his anger towards Ukraine. And that is stupid because, if China is the major opponent for the United States, that's actually pushing the rest of the world towards China. And, it could end in disaster for America's foreign policy. So I think that the deal should be made, but it's what's in the deal and the respect surrounding that deal that's of crucial importance here.
That respect piece is interesting because this war of words seems to be, each side sort of demanding that respect of each other. We've seen President Zelensky push back on Trump, but then the Trump administration appears to be digging in. Vice President J.D. Vance now calling Zelensky's public disagreements with Trump disgraceful. He says it's not something that's going to move the president of the United States. In fact, it's going to have the opposite effect. And take a listen to these other comments from President Trump and now his national security advisor as well.
You can't bring a war to an end if you don't talk to both sides. You got to talk. They haven't been talking for 3 years.
I don't think anyone should be really, criticizing the president for trying to drive this to a diplomatic solution. Why hasn't President Zelensky tried to end this war for the betterment of his country? And we have to ask ourselves, is Ukraine's position improving or not?
Igor, what options do you see that President Zelensky has at this point?
Well, I think he has a major asset, one of the best assets ever, to be had by a president, that is Ukrainian people. And I think, look, Ukraine hasn't given up over the last 3 years. Kiev hasn't fallen. So I don't think at this point trying to kind of appease that will to quickly end the war by just surrendering Ukraine to Russia. I don't think that's an option for President Zelensky. I don't think that's an option for the Ukrainian people. And we're just going to keep fighting. We're very good at saying no. So I'm all in favor of a diplomatic solution, but there's a difference between a fair, just, and lasting peace and surrender.
Igor Novikov, I really appreciate your time, your perspective, your insights. Thanks so much for joining us.